The foreign relations of New Zealand are oriented chiefly toward developed democratic nations and emerging Pacific economies. The country's major political parties have generally agreed on the broad outlines of foreign policy, and the current coalition government has been active in promoting free trade, nuclear disarmament, and arms control. In summer 2013, Foreign Minister Murray McCully reported that all New Zealand's important relationships are in good repair. With the United States, there are hopes of a major breakthrough in terms of trade relations. Sino New Zealand relations are also subdued, but trade is burgeoning. Japan's decision to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a welcome change, and New Zealand continues to pursue a free trade agreement with South Korea. The government is pressing ahead with plans to strengthen relations in a number of other areas, including Russia, South Asia, Latin America, the Persian Gulf, and especially the South Pacific. It is also alive to the potential benefits of closer ties with countries on the African continent. History. Maori rule New Zealand was first settled by Polynesians at some point between 800 and 1300 AD. For the 1760s, New Zealand was visited by various European explorers and traders, and later missionaries and settlers. An informal system of trade was established, especially in Northland, and some iwi became wealthy and powerful. As Maori was a tribal-level society of many shifting chiefdoms, relationships with Europeans were ad hoc and informal. In 1835, a group of Northland chiefs, under the guidance of British resident James Busby, signed a Declaration of Independence, which was recognized by Britain. British colony. Many Maori were still worried that a European power might invade and dispossess them, and some iwi were having difficulties controlling the large numbers of Europeans who visited and settled in their areas. English missionaries were also concerned about the levels of lawlessness, which were undermining their efforts to convert Maori to Christianity. The British Colonial Office, influenced by the missionaries and by reports that the independent New Zealand Company was planning to privately colonize the islands, sent naval captain William Hobson to negotiate a treaty. The subsequent Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, made New Zealand part of the British Empire, established a governor of New Zealand, and gave Maori the rights of British subjects. The annexation of New Zealand by Britain meant that Britain now controlled New Zealand's foreign policy. Subsidized large-scale immigration from Britain and Ireland began, and miners came for the gold rush around 1850 to 60. In the 1860s, the British sent 16,000 soldiers to contain the New Zealand wars in the North Island. The colony shipped gold and, especially, wool to Britain. For the 1880s, the development of refrigerated shipping allowed the establishment of an export economy based on the mass export of frozen meat and dairy products to Britain. In 1899 to 1902, New Zealand made its first contribution to an external war, sending troops to fight on the British side in the Second Boer War. The country changed its status from colony to dominion with internal self-governance in 1907. New Zealand eagerly sent a large fraction of its young men to fight on Britain's side in the First World War. The heroism in the failed Gallipoli campaign made the sacrifices iconic in New Zealand memory, and secured the psychological independence of the nation. After the war, New Zealand signed the Treaty of Versailles, joined the League of Nations, and pursued an independent foreign policy, while its defence was still controlled by Britain. Wellington trusted Conservative Party governments in London, but not Labour. When the British Labour Party took power in 1924 and 1929, The New Zealand government felt threatened by Labour's foreign policy because of its reliance upon the League of Nations. The League was distrusted and Wellington did not expect to see the coming of a peaceful world order under League auspices. What had been the Empire's most loyal dominion became a dissenter as it opposed efforts the first and second British Labour governments to trust the League's framework of arbitration and collective security agreements. The governments of the Reform and United parties between 1912 and 1935 followed a realistic foreign policy. They made national security a high priority, were skeptical of international institutions such as the League, and showed no interest on the questions of self-determination, democracy, and human rights. However, the opposition Labour Party was more idealistic and proposed a liberal internationalist outlook on international affairs. From 1935 the first Labour government showed a limited degree of idealism in foreign policy, for example opposing the appeasement of Germany and Japan. Second World War. When World War II broke out in 1939, New Zealand wholeheartedly joined in the defence of Britain, with Prime Minister Michael Joseph Savage declaring that, "Where Britain goes, we go. Where Britain stands, we stand." New Zealand soldiers served in North Africa, Italy and the Pacific, and airmen in England and the Pacific, throughout the war, even when New Zealand had concerns about invasion by the Japanese. In 1947 New Zealand ratified the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which made certain former colonies completely self-governing. The fall of Singapore during World War II made New Zealand realize that she could no longer rely on Britain to defend the British Empire. New Zealand troops supported the British in the successful battle against communist insurrection in Malaysia and maintained an Air Force fighter squadron in Singapore, and later on Cyprus, against supporting British forces. New Zealand diplomats sought an alliance with the United States of America, and in 1951 adhered to the ANZ-US Treaty between New Zealand, Australia and the US. In return for America's guarantee of protection, New Zealand felt obliged to support America in its wars, and New Zealand committed forces to the Korean War under United Nations auspices and to the Vietnam War. By the 1970s, many New Zealanders began to feel uncomfortable with the country's support for the US, particularly in Vietnam and regarding the visits of nuclear-powered and armed American warships. The third Labour government pulled New Zealand troops out of the Vietnam War and protested against French nuclear testing in the Pacific, at one stage sending a warship to act as disapproving witness to the tests. Britain's entry into the European Economic Community in 1973 forced New Zealand into a more independent role. The British move restricted New Zealand's trade access to its biggest market, and it sought new trading partners in Asia, America and the Middle East. Australia and New Zealand signed the Free Trade Closer Economic Relations Agreement in 1983. The election of the fourth Labour government in 1984 marked a new period of independent foreign policy. Nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed ships were banned from New Zealand waters, effectively removing New Zealand from the ANZ-US Pact. Immigration laws were liberalized, leading to a massive increase in immigration from Asia. The fourth national government liberalized trade by removing most tariffs and import restrictions. In 2008, Minister of Foreign Affairs Winston Peters announced what he called a seismic change for New Zealand's foreign service, designed to remedy the country's struggling to maintain an adequate presence on the international stage. Peters said that the ministry would receive additional funding and increase the number of New Zealand diplomats serving abroad by 50%. However, this policy was reversed following the 2008 general election, which brought the John Key-led Fifth National Government of New Zealand to power. United Nations. New Zealand was a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser felt that in order for New Zealand to be secure in the South Pacific, it need to align itself with major world powers like the United States through some kind of organization that could guarantee small powers a say in world affairs. Since the defeat of the Royal Navy during World War II, it became clear that Britain was no longer able to protect New Zealand, so the government decided that a policy of independent relations with a group of strong powers was the best way to defend New Zealand. Participation in international organizations. New Zealand participates in the United Nations, World Trade Organization, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, International Energy Agency, Asian Development Bank, Pacific Islands Forum, Secretariat of the Pacific Community, Colombo Plan, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and the International Whaling Commission. New Zealand also is an active member of the Commonwealth. Despite the 1985 rupture in the ANZ-US alliance, New Zealand has maintained good working relations with the United States and Australia on a broad array of international issues. In the past, New Zealand's geographic isolation and its agricultural economy's general prosperity minimized public interest in international affairs. However, growing global trade and other international economic events have made New Zealanders increasingly aware of the country's dependence on unstable, overseas markets. New Zealand is a strong advocate of free trade, especially in agricultural products, and is a member of the Cairns Group of Nations in the WTO. New Zealand's economic involvement with Asia is increasingly important. New Zealand is a dialogue partner with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a member of the East Asia Summit and an active participant in APEC. As a charter member of the Colombo Plan, New Zealand has provided Asian countries with technical assistance and capital. It also contributes through the Asian Development Bank and through UN programs, and is a member of the UN Economic and Social Council for Asia and the Pacific. Summary of international organization participation: ABEDA, ANZUS, APEC, ARF, ASDB, ASEAN, Australia Group, Commonwealth, CP, EBRD, ESCAP, FAO, IAEA, IBRD, ICAO, ICC, ICCT, ICFDU, ICRM, IDA, IEA, IFAD, IFC, IFRCS, IHO, ILO, IMF, IMO, Interpol, IOC, IOM, ISO, ITU, NAM, NSG, OECD, OPCW, PCA, PIF, Spartaca, SPC, UN, UNAMSIL, UNCTAD, UNESCO, UNHCR, UNIDO, UNMIK, UNMISCT, UNMOP, UNTSO, UPU, WCO, WFDU, WHO, WIPO, WMO, WTO. Overseas territories. New Zealand administers Tokelau as a non-self-governing colonial territory. In February 2006, a UN-sponsored referendum was held in Tokelau on whether to become a self-governing state, but this failed to achieve the two-thirds majority required to pass. Samoa was a New Zealand protectorate from 1918 to full independence in 1962. However, New Zealand retains some responsibilities for former colonies, Niue and the Cook Islands, which are in free association with New Zealand. Citizens of all three countries hold New Zealand citizenship and the associated rights to healthcare and education in New Zealand. New Zealand has also claimed part of Antarctica known as the Ross Dependency since 1923. Trade. McGraw argues that probably the greatest foreign policy achievement of Clark's term was the conclusion of a free trade agreement with China. Clark's government also set up a free trade deal deal with Australia and the 10 nations of ASEAN. New Zealand has existing free trade agreements with Australia, Brunei, Chile, the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand. New free trade agreements are under negotiation with ASEAN and Malaysia. New Zealand is involved in the WTO's Doha Development Agenda and was disappointed by the failure of the most recent talks in July 2006. New Zealand's main export is food, primarily dairy products, meat, fruit and fish. About 95% of the country's agricultural produce is exported. Other major exports are wood, and mechanical and electrical equipment. About 46% of exports are non-agricultural, but the largest industry is still the food industry. Tourism is also an extremely important component of international trade. Transport and travel form around 20% of the country's export trade. New Zealand does not have large quantities of mineral resources, though it does produce some coal, oil, aluminium and natural gas. New Zealand's largest source of imports is China, followed by Australia, the United States, Japan, and Singapore. The largest destinations for exports are, in order, Australia, China, the US, Japan, and South Korea. Trade figures for 2011 with New Zealand's biggest trade partners are as follows. Military. The New Zealand Defence Force is small compared to many other countries, although it is regarded as very professional. Its overseas duties consist mostly of peacekeeping, especially in the Pacific. In the 21st century, peacekeeping detachments have been deployed to East Timor, the Solomon Islands, and Tonga. Engineering and support forces have also been involved in the Iraq War, although New Zealand is not a member of the Coalition of the Willing. New Zealand's heaviest military involvement in recent decades has been in Afghanistan following the United States-led invasion of the country after the 11th of September 2001 attacks. The deployment has included SASH troops. Foreign aid. New Zealand's official aid program is managed by the New Zealand Agency for International Development, a semi-autonomous body within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In 2007, New Zealand was the sixth lowest foreign aid donor in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, based on proportion of gross national income spent on overseas development assistance. New Zealand's contribution was 0.27% of GNI. Much this went to the Pacific region. However, the country is occasionally more generous in responding to major crises, for example donating around 100 million New Zealand dollars to the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake relief effort. New Zealand troops and aircraft are also often sent to disaster areas in the Asia-Pacific. Nuclear-free policy. In the 1970s and 1980s, anti-nuclear sentiment increased across New Zealand, fueling concerns about French nuclear testing in the Pacific at Mururoa Atoll. The third Labour government under Norman Kirk, co-sponsored by Australia, took France before the International Court of Justice in 1972, requesting that the French cease atmospheric nuclear testing at Mururoa Atoll in French Polynesia in the southern Pacific Ocean. In 1972, as an act of defiance and protest, the Kirk government sent two of its Navy frigates, HMNZS Canterbury and Otago, into the Mururoa test zone area. Peace yachts attempting to disrupt the French tests had been sailing in coordinated protests into the Mururoa exclusion zones between 1972 to 1991. Concerns about nuclear proliferation and the presence of nuclear warheads or reactors on United States Navy ships visiting New Zealand ports continued to escalate. After it was elected in 1984, the Labour Party government of David Long indicated its opposition to visits by such ships. In February 1985, New Zealand turned away the US Buchanan, and in response the United States announced that it was suspending its treaty obligations to New Zealand, unless port access was restored. In 1987, the Labour government strengthened its stance by declaring New Zealand a nuclear-free zone, effectively legally removing New Zealand from the nuclear deterrent scenario and banning the entry of nuclear-powered warships into its ports. Warships that did not fall into this category were not blocked, but the US took the view that any subsequent visit by warship to New Zealand could not be carried out without violating the US security policy of neither confirming nor denying nuclear capability of its ships. After increasingly acrimonious debates, in August 1986 the United States formally suspended its security obligations to New Zealand that it had under the ANZ US Mutual Defense Pact. This suspension remains in effect today, although the US no longer carries nuclear weapons aboard its surface naval vessels. In 1987, New Zealand passed legislation making the country a nuclear-free zone, namely the New Zealand Nuclear-Free Zone, Disarmament, and Arms Control Act. In the same year, the US retaliated with the Broomfield Act, designating New Zealand as a friend rather than an ally. Relations between New Zealand and the US have had several ups and downs since then. In recent years, some voices have suggested removing the anti-nuclear legislation, especially the ACT New Zealand political party, and up until February 2006 the National Party was in favour of holding a referendum on the issue. However, public opinion remains strongly in favour of the country's status as a nuclear-free zone. In May 2006, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Christopher Hill, described the disagreement between the U.S. and New Zealand as a relic, but also signaled that the U.S. wanted a closer defense relationship with New Zealand and praised New Zealand's involvement in Afghanistan and reconstruction in Iraq. Rather than trying to change each other's minds on the nuclear issue, which is a bit of a relic, I think we should focus on things we can make work, he told the Australian Financial Review. Pressure from the United States on New Zealand's foreign policy increased in 2006, with U.S. trade officials linking the repeal of the ban of American nuclear ships from New Zealand's ports to a potential free trade agreement between the two countries. Relations between France and New Zealand were strained for two short periods in the 1980s and 1990s over the French nuclear tests at Mururoa and the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour. The latter was widely regarded as an act of state terrorism against New Zealand's sovereignty and was ordered by then-French President François Mitterrand, although he denied any involvement at the time. These events worked to strengthen New Zealand's resolve to retain its anti-nuclear policy. Relations between the two countries are now cordial, with strong trade and many new bilateral links. Pacific relations. Much of New Zealand's foreign policy is focused on the Pacific region, particularly Polynesia and Melanesia. Bilateral economic assistance resources have been focused on projects in the South Pacific island states, especially on Bougainville. The country's long association with Samoa, reflected in a treaty of friendship signed in 1962, and its close association with Tonga have resulted in a flow of immigrants and visitors under work permit schemes from both countries. Recently, New Zealand forces participated in peacekeeping efforts in the Pacific region in East Timor, the Solomon Islands and Tonga. See Military history of New Zealand. In 1947, New Zealand joined Australia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States to form the South Pacific Commission, a regional body to promote the welfare of the Pacific region. New Zealand has been a leader in the organization. In 1971, New Zealand joined the other independent and self-governing states of the South Pacific to establish the South Pacific Forum, which meets annually at the heads of government level. 2006 East Timor crisis. On the 26th of May, New Zealand deployed 42 troops, with a second contingent of 120 troops leaving Christchurch on the 27th of May, en route to Townsville, Queensland, before being sent to East Timor. Clark said that the forces would be deployed where needed by the Australian command.